They were greasy, smoky, and slapped together with bare hands. Wild West sandwiches fed outlaws, drifters, and dying dreams. What vanished from our tables when we stopped eating like the frontier? Under a sky streaked with dust and silence, salt pork biscuit sliders hit the trail like edible armor. Thick slabs of salt-cured pork, fried until the edges curled, were slapped between fresh biscuits, or hardtack if luck had run dry. This was not a dainty sandwich. It was chewy, greasy, and wildly salty, perfect for men riding 10 hours a day and chasing cattle or trouble. The salt kept the meat from spoiling and gave it a fierce bite that could jolt the senses awake after miles of prairie stillness. Some cowboys softened their hardtack with coffee. Others dunked the whole sandwich into grease drippings or gravy if a chuck wagon was near. You did not eat this with conversation. It was more of a jaw workout than a lunch. But out on the plains, you were lucky to have meat at all, much less the bread to go with it. Salt pork biscuit sliders were not made for comfort. They were made to keep you riding. And for a generation of frontier men who had more dust in their lungs than dreams in their pockets, that was more than enough. Cold cornbread and lard sandwiches were not something you craved. They were what you had when craving was a luxury. Picture a thick square of yesterday's cornbread, cold and crumbling with a generous smear of pork lard seasoned only by a pinch of salt or the leftover flavor of whatever it had been fried in the day before. There was no meat in sight, just fat and crumbs and the memory of a meal that had once been hot. Cowboys and homesteaders packed these sandwiches for long treks or slow days in the fields, not because they were delicious, but because they worked. Lard gave energy. Cornbread kept your stomach from echoing. If you were lucky, the cornbread had bits of crackling or jalapeno in it. If not, it was dry and plain and stubborn. Some folks would drizzle molasses over the top, trying to sweeten the sadness, but most just ate in silence and carried on. These were sandwiches that spoke a truth no one wanted to say out loud. Hunger made simple things enough. Pemmican and berry flatbread wraps were survival food dressed as tradition. Born from the native scouts and fur trappers who knew the land better than anyone else, this rough, nutrient-packed mash was made from dried meat, rendered fat, and crushed berries. Rolled into dense cakes or spread inside fry bread or ash cakes, pemmican could last for months and carry a man through winter. It was chewy, often sour, and left a taste that clung to your teeth. The berries, usually chokecherries or blueberries, added tartness and a rare flash of sweetness to the otherwise heavy meat paste. This was not a sandwich you bit into for flavor. It was fuel, medicine, history in your hands. Wrapped in whatever bread you had, it made the difference between starvation and another mile down the trapline. And though it came from necessity, pemmican wraps were made with purpose and pride. It was one of the few foods of the Wild West that carried with it both survival and heritage. And when the wagons moved west and hunger followed, this ancient sandwich came along for the ride. Beef drippings and onion sandwiches were what happened when the roast was long gone but the skillet still remembered. You would take a scrap of bread, soak it in the beef grease left behind in the pan, and then fry up some sliced onion until it was dark, blistered, and sweet. The sandwich was often assembled right in the pan, one piece of bread flipped onto the onions to soak up all the remaining fat. It smelled like heaven and looked like hardship. This was lunch for the family that had already stretched one piece of meat across 3 meals. The flavor was unbelievable, meaty, smoky, with the kind of richness you can only get when you are desperate enough to turn drippings into dinner. It was greasy enough to shine through brown paper and comforting enough to taste like Sunday morning on a Wednesday night. You did not need a full roast to eat like you had one. You just needed memory and fire. Buffalo jerky sandwiches were not about tenderness. You would soak the dried meat in water or coffee until it gave up a little of its resistance, then layer it between flatbread or slap it over beans and mustard. It was a food made for teeth and silence. The flavor was smoky, wild, and as tough as the men who chewed it. Buffalo meat had fed tribes and wagon trains alike, but by the late 1800s, finding it meant you either hunted it yourself or knew someone who did. Most of the jerky was homemade, pounded thin with rocks and left to dry on sun-baked hides. Sandwiches made from it were makeshift, but they packed a punch of flavor that stayed with you long after the meal was gone. If you had pickles or wild onion, you might toss some in. If not, you chewed and waited for the salt to wake you up. It was a taste that belonged to open skies and stolen time. Fried cabbage and bacon foldovers were a skillet-born miracle. You would chop cabbage thin, let it sizzle in bacon grease until it browned and softened, then stuff it between two rough cakes of bread or griddle-made flapjacks. The bacon was not always visible. Sometimes it was just the ghost of flavor left behind in the pan. But the mix was hot, filling, and surprisingly addictive. Cabbage was cheap, easy to grow, and hard to ruin, which made it a favorite for chuck wagons and frontier kitchens alike. Fold it over, wrap it in paper or cloth, and it would hold up for a full day's ride or labor in the field. This was comfort food before the word existed. Every bite had that buttery, smoky taste of bacon, and the soft sweetness of cabbage turned golden. You did not need cheese or sauce, just fire and timing. It was the kind of sandwich that made the best of what little you had and taught you to never waste a scrap of flavor. Molasses ham biscuit sandwiches were the Cowboy's version of Sunday best. Cold slices of salted ham, usually left over from the previous night's big meal, were layered on fresh biscuits and slathered with a thick smear of dark molasses. It was sweet, salty, and messy enough to stain your fingers and your shirt. The molasses was strong, sometimes bitter, sometimes syrupy, but always bold enough to cut through the cured meat. On the trail or at the ranch, this sandwich felt like a reward, like someone had remembered you liked good food. Biscuits were made fresh when supplies allowed, often with lard and love, and that flaky texture paired with the slick of ham fat made this a rare treat. Cowboys carried it wrapped in cloth, eating it cold under trees or stars. It was one of the few meals that felt like a story, of home, of family, of something more than work and dust. For a few bites, the world softened. Pinto bean patties on cornbread slabs were what happened when meat ran out, but pride did not. You would mash yesterday's beans, season them with onion or lard, and fry them into rough little cakes. Then you slapped them between thick slices of cornbread, maybe dry, maybe still warm if you were lucky. It was heavy, filling, and shockingly good. Pinto beans were the backbone of frontier food, cheap, storable, and full of the kind of energy you needed for long days and longer nights. The patties crisped up on the outside but stayed creamy inside, making them feel almost indulgent. Cornbread was dry by the next day, but once you stacked it with beans and fried edges, it came alive again. This sandwich fed whole families when flour was low and meat was gone. It was about turning scraps into something hot, fried, and filling. Something you could eat with two hands and still taste an hour later. Scrap sausage and apple chokecherry chutney rolls were the Wild West version of sweet and savory. Whatever bits of sausage were left, spiced pork, beef, even squirrel, were mashed, fried, and rolled into rough bread with a dollop of wild chutney made from apples and foraged chokecherries. The result was something almost elegant, though no one at the time would have called it that. The chutney was tart, almost bitter, but balanced the grease and salt of the sausage like it was meant to. You would make these sandwiches for long rides, special meals, or when someone needed cheering up. You could wrap it in wax cloth or eat it right off the griddle. Either way, it was warm, sticky, and full of contrast. Sweet fruit and wild meat, smoke and sugar. These sandwiches were the kind you remembered long after you had eaten them. They were resourceful and emotional. They made use of everything, even sadness. Sourdough starter bread with cold tallow and pepper was not a celebration. It was what you ate when your firewood ran low and your hopes ran lower. Dense, tangy slices of sourdough, baked days earlier, were spread with cold beef tallow scraped from a tin, then dusted with black pepper if you had it. No warmth, no sizzle, just calories and survival. This sandwich was the miner's standby, the trapper's fallback, the widow's winter lunch. Tallow kept you going. Sourdough kept you sane. You had to chew slowly, not just because the bread was dense, but because the quiet made everything feel heavier. There was no illusion here. It was a meal made by necessity, not desire, but it did its job. It filled you up. It reminded you that tomorrow might be better, or it might not. Either way, you would still eat. Crispy pancake sandwich with dried peach butter was the kind of breakfast for dinner trick that made even the leanest pantry feel like a treat. Folks would fold up a pair of thin griddle cakes, sometimes crisped on cast iron until the edges curled and browned, and smear the inside with dried peach butter, if they had it. The butter was a stretch of summer sealed in a jar, made from boiled down fruit leather and a little sugar if it could be spared. The pancakes acted like an edible envelope, trapping sweetness that softened the wear of hard living. It wasn't just kids who loved it. Tired men coming in from chopping wood or herding cattle would bite in with a kind of silent gratitude. The butter would melt ever so slightly from the residual heat of the pancake, and suddenly the air smelled like sun-warmed orchards. Sometimes folks added a pinch of salt or a dab of lard for depth. And if the peach butter ran out, they used plum or apple, or even mashed dried prunes if that's what was left. It was comfort disguised as necessity, a pocket of hope you could hold in your hand. Roasted coffee-glazed pork sandwich wasn't a thing of indulgence. It was what you did when the camp coffee was bitter, the sugar was crusted at the bottom of the bag, and the pork belly needed cooking before the flies caught wind. Cowboys would brew up a dark pot of yesterday's coffee, reduce it with sugar, and brush it onto the pork before setting it over the coals. The glaze would sear into the fat, giving it a bark that was smoky, sweet, and slightly burnt like all good trail food ought to be. Once roasted and cooled, slices were shaved thin, if you had a knife sharp enough, and stacked between two hunks of bread or biscuit. The bitterness of the coffee mixed with the pork's salt and fat in a way that stuck with you, both in flavor and in memory. Sometimes they'd add a ring of raw onion or a smear of mustard if a tin was rolling around in a saddlebag. But more often it was just meat and bread and the taste of fire. Out on the trail, this was the closest thing to a delicacy a man might ever know. Cold bean and molasses. Slather sandwich was the kind of meal that looked like punishment, but tasted like stubborn joy. You'd take a tin of cooked beans, usually pintos left from supper, and mash them with a spoon until they were thick enough to spread. Then came the molasses, a long, slow pour that turned the mixture into something halfway between savory and dessert. The whole mess got slapped onto cornbread or a chunk of flatbread, depending on what you had. If the bread was stale, you dunked it in water and fried it up before spreading. This sandwich stuck to your ribs, your fingers, and your soul. Sweet, sticky, protein-packed. It filled you up in ways a biscuit alone never could. Some said it was poor man's pudding. Others just said it kept the hunger away until the sun went down. But if you'd ever eaten one cold, straight from a wax paper wrap while watching dust curl over the road, you'd know there was more love in it than most would guess. Onion ash sandwich was what you ate when everything else was gone, but you still had fire and a little time. You'd take whole onions, sometimes with the skin still on, and toss them straight into the coals. Let them blacken until their outer layers blistered and cracked. Once the embers did their work, you'd fish them out, blow off the ash, and peel to the soft, sweet inside. Then came the smashing, on a flat rock with the heel of your hand, whatever was nearby, until the softened onions turned to a kind of pulp. That pulp got smeared onto whatever bread was handy, then sprinkled with salt if you had it. No butter, no meat, no fancy. Just the charred ghost of something that once grew in dirt and the fire that made it edible. This was a sandwich born of need, made when provisions ran dry and even the dogs knew there was no dinner coming. And yet, it was deeply comforting in its own strange way. The sweetness of the onion, the crackle of ash, the simplicity of it all, like you were sharing something sacred with the fire itself. Venison cold cut. Sandwich with juniper jelly wasn't your everyday trail food. It was the kind of thing you'd find wrapped in wax paper at the bottom of a widow's picnic basket. Cured venison, sliced thin and tough as rawhide, gave off that wild, iron-rich scent that only game meat can. It was the kind of meat that lingered in your teeth and your memory. But the real magic was the juniper jelly, dark, sharp, and just sweet enough to tame the gaminess. Women made it from the berries they picked near fence posts and dried creek beds, boiling them down with sugar and a little lemon if they were lucky. That jelly turned the sandwich into something almost refined. The bread was usually coarse and dense, rye, oat, or whatever flour could be scrounged, but it held everything together like a cold hand around a warm flame. You didn't need much, just a slice or two of meat, a smear of that wild jelly, and a quiet place to eat it. It tasted like loneliness, survival, and some kind of fierce dignity. Potato peel griddle pocket was a triumph of thrift. When you were out of actual potatoes, the peels became the star. You'd save them in a tin, rinse off the dirt, and fry them up in leftover grease. Bacon, beef, even bear if the season had been kind. The peels would crisp like paper and curl at the edges, hissing against the iron. Then you'd spoon them into a folded pocket of hot griddle bread, still steaming from the skillet. A splash of vinegar, if you had it, added brightness that cut through the fat. If you didn't, maybe a pinch of salt, or just the heat of the bread would do. The sandwich crackled when you bit into it, filling your mouth with salt, starch, and smoke. It was humble food, no doubt, but you couldn't say it wasn't satisfying. The kind of thing you made when there was nothing left to waste and no appetite for complaint. It reminded folks that a meal didn't have to be fancy to be filling. It just had to be made with intention and a hot skillet. Cornmeal. Johnny Cake sandwich with smoked meat was one of those meals that turned scarcity into something resembling pride. Johnny Cakes, griddled discs of cornmeal batter, were cheap, sturdy, and blessedly shelf-stable. If you had a fire and a tin of meal, you could make a dozen. But what made the sandwich was the meat, always smoked to last the winter. Could be pork, could be squirrel, could be something nobody wanted to name. Shredded and reheated over a flicker of flame, the meat got tucked between two cakes like it belonged there. Sometimes folks added mashed beans, onions, or even a smear of grease to stretch it out. The cakes were firm and slightly sweet, holding their own against the salt and smoke of the filling. Eaten warm, it was a meal. Eaten cold, it was a reminder. Either way, it filled the belly and kept you moving. And there was something about the smell, corn, char, and old wood smoke that made you think of 100 hungry winters and the grit it took to survive them. Sardine and pickled egg sandwich was not for the faint of heart or nose. This pungent miner's special was often cobbled together from tins and jars brought up the shaft or scavenged from a storehouse shelf. Sardines, packed in oil or mustard sauce, were mashed with the side of a fork until they were almost spreadable. Then came the pickled egg, sliced thin and sharp with vinegar and spice. The two collided inside a biscuit or chunk of bread like a freight train of salt, fat, and acid. There was no hiding this sandwich. It announced itself from a distance. But those who loved it swore by its power. It kept men alert, gave them enough salt to fight off faintness, and could be made in a hurry. If you were lucky, you'd get a sliver of onion or a few mustard seeds mixed in. Most times it was just fish and egg and the need to feel full before the next shift underground. Dried trout and vinegar. Slaw biscuit was a sandwich built for those who lived near mountain streams and knew how to make every catch last. Trout were cold smoked over green wood, then dried hard as stone. When it came time to eat, you'd soak a fillet in hot water or cider, then flake it apart with your fingers. The slaw was made from whatever you had: shredded cabbage, wild onions, maybe even grated apple, soaked in vinegar and salt until it bit back. The biscuit was thick and dry, meant to soak up the juices without falling apart. You'd layer the trout and slaw, fold the biscuit over like a book, and press it all together. It was tangy, smoky, and so alive with flavor that it almost made you forget how little food there really was. Not many people today would crave it, but those who knew it once still remember the crunch, the salt, and the steam rising off cold hands in the early light. Hot brick cheese melt was a cow hand's comfort, crafted without pans, ovens, or any luxury but a fire and time. You'd find a flat brick or smooth stone, place it near the coals until it was good and hot, then slap your bread on top. Slices of aged cheddar or whatever passed for cheese in your camp were laid over the top with maybe a pinch of dried herbs or crushed peppercorn. The heat from the brick toasted the bottom while the cheese slowly melted into the bread, fusing everything into a golden crust of fire-warmed goodness. If you were real clever, you'd flip it once and get both sides crisp. The result was smoky, cheesy, and deeply satisfying in a way only open-fire food can be. There was no fancy name for it, just bread, cheese, heat, and hunger. But when you bit in and the edges crackled like burnt parchment, you knew you were eating something earned, not given. Hard-boiled eggs were easy enough to carry, but it was the fat, rendered from whatever animal had been butchered last, that made this sandwich stick to your ribs. Spring onions pulled from the edge of the garden plot or found wild added a sharp bite, while thick slices of pan-fried bread held it all together. This wasn't luxury. This was fuel. Folks who worked from sunrise to nightfall needed food that lasted, that clung to your insides and kept you moving. The onion fat got stronger the longer it sat out, sometimes making the sandwich taste like a dare. But out in the sun, with sweat on your brow, you didn't think twice. You took a bite, wiped your hands on your pants, and got back to work. Nothing wasted, nothing fancy, just calories layered between two browned slabs of whatever you had. It was food that knew what it meant to be tired, food that respected a calloused hand. Smoky beans were never really meant to be elegant. You mashed them with a little leftover bacon grease, stirred in a trace of salt, and when you were lucky, a pinch of hot ash right from the fire. That ash gave it something no spice rack ever could, the flavor of hardship and open flame. Slathered thick onto bread cooked on a stone near the coals, the smoky spread stuck to your gums in the best way. It was warm, filling, and didn't spoil fast. You could eat it cold by the second day. Just slap it between two pieces of last week's crusty ash bread and call it dinner. Some folks added a scrap of onion or dried pepper flakes, but mostly it was just beans and smoke and whatever grit you already had in your teeth. It wasn't made to impress. It was made to fill that emptiness you carried after a long day riding fence or hauling wood. This one tasted like confusion in the best way. Sweet, prickly pear jam you boiled down yourself, and salted pork so tough you had to chew it like rope. The jam came from careful hands braving the cactus thorns at the edge of the property. The pork came from last winter's slaughter, cured and stashed in the smokehouse until it was half forgotten. Put together, they told a story. Sugar for survival, meat for muscle. The bread was whatever you had. Maybe a slab of skillet cornmeal loaf or yesterday's biscuit gone firm. The salt of the pork made your lips sting, while the jam pulled your tongue in the other direction. It stuck in your memory, the kind of sandwich you only made when you were desperate, creative, or just tired of chewing on the same thing every day. Every bite was a tug of war between the wild and the worn, between sweet hope and salted memory. If it was the tail end of the week and you hadn't been to town, this was what you made. Bell peppers, blackened over open flame until their skins blistered and softened, got stripped down and stuffed into fry bread still warm from the griddle. Corn, roasted if you had time, boiled if you didn't, gave it crunch. The kicker? A splash of chili vinegar made from dried peppers left to soak in a jar behind the stove. You wrapped the whole thing in a cloth and let it steam a little, like a poor man's tamale. No meat, no dairy, just vegetables made bold with fire and acid. It smelled better than it looked, and it tasted better than it had any right to. By the time you were halfway through, your hands were dripping oil and vinegar, but your stomach was thankful. It was a sandwich that made a meal out of what most folks called scraps, and made it feel like supper. Bone marrow was gold if you could get it. When a cow or deer was butchered, smart folks roasted the bones right in the coals. The marrow inside melted into a hot, buttery sludge, rich with everything a body craved after a long ride. You'd scoop it straight onto a cornmeal roll or hard biscuit, maybe add a pinch of salt or wild garlic if you had it. The marrow soaked into the bread like fire into dry wood, turning even the crustiest roll into something near heavenly. It was greasy, messy, and gone in 2 bites. But it warmed your chest like nothing else. Some cowhands joked it was the closest thing they had to fine dining. If you were lucky, the roll was made fresh. If not, it was stale and hard, but the marrow didn't care. It made kings out of commoners for a minute or two, and in lean times that was worth its weight in salt. Corn, blackstrap molasses, and bacon fat. That was it. You'd mash the corn, boiled, roasted, even canned if it came off a wagon, with a dollop of thick molasses and a spoonful of leftover bacon grease scraped from the pan. Slathered between two hunks of fried cornmeal cake, it tasted like burnt sugar and smoke, soft with a crunch here and there. It stuck to your fingers, your lips, and the roof of your mouth. But you didn't mind. It filled you up, made you feel like you'd eaten something real. Sweet and savory had no business going together back then, but in this sandwich, they made peace. Kids loved it, though they'd end up with faces sticky as flypaper. Adults called it dessert you could work on. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't clean, but it made use of everything you had and gave nothing to the chickens. That's how people ate when every bite counted. Meat scraps were never wasted. Not ever. At the end of the night, you'd scrape together whatever was left. Bits of ham rind, smoked sausage ends, gristle from beef stew, and chop it all fine. Mix in some biscuit crumbs from the bottom of the bread sack, and suddenly you had yourself a meal. Maybe you fried it all first, maybe you didn't. Slap it between the last two halves of cold biscuit or fold it up in a flatbread, and you had the kind of sandwich only hunger could invent. The flavors were never the same twice, sometimes spicy, sometimes sweet, depending on what made it into the mix. But always salty. It was the food of campfires and late nights, when the lantern was low and no one had the energy to cook something proper. You'd eat it in 2 bites and wonder where it went, but your stomach knew. That was cowboy thrift, made edible. There was something almost holy about the way cowhands made use of everything, even milk that had just barely gone bad. When milk soured out on the trail or in the bunkhouse, they did not toss it. They curdled it slow, wrapped it in cloth, and let it sit just long enough to form a dry, crumbly cheese. It was sharp, a little funky, and absolutely perfect when paired with whatever herbs could be found growing wild: sage, wild onion, or a little prairie parsley. That mix went straight onto thick slices of sour rye or rough wheat bread that had been left near the fire to dry out just enough to hold together without turning to mush. There was no mayonnaise, no fancy deli meat, just dry bread, curd, and a pinch of something green that could make it taste fresh, even if it came out of a leather pouch. You can almost taste the wind in that sandwich. It filled your gut without weighing you down, and you could eat it with one hand while the other stayed on the reins. For men who spent their days chasing cattle across scorching plains, it was enough to feel human again for just a moment. Sometimes that is all a sandwich really needs to do. Nobody really wanted to eat liver, not at first. But out on the cattle stations, when rations ran thin and the cook had to scrape together anything that was left, liver became a lifeline. They would take the offal, usually beef liver, and smoke it right over the campfire until it got that bitter, iron-rich crust. Then they mashed it with leftover fat, black pepper, and sometimes just a splash of vinegar or coffee to kill the harshest edge. It turned into a greasy, pungent spread that went perfectly on slices of fire-blackened toast. The toast was rarely intentional. Bread just burned quickly on an open flame. But that char gave it crunch, bite, and a taste of something scorched and real. The result was powerful, earthy, and not something you forgot. Some cowboys swore it tasted better after a hard ride. Others said it was like chewing regret on a biscuit. But everyone ate it. Because out there, where the sun cracked your skin and the dust settled into your teeth, a meal that stuck to your ribs and stayed in your memory was better than going hungry. Even the bitterness became part of the comfort. When bread ran out, and it often did, resourceful hands turned to cabbage. Big, flexible leaves were peeled from the head, rinsed in creek water, and dried in the open air until they were soft but sturdy. Then came the salt beef. Tough, chewy, and brined until it could outlive a blizzard, it was sliced thin and slapped cold between those green sheets like the world's most desperate deli meat. It was not glamorous. It was not even always tasty. But it worked. The cabbage kept your hands clean, the beef gave you protein, and if you were lucky, someone had a jar of vinegar or mustard root paste to smear inside. This was the kind of meal made on the floor of a barn or at the back end of a chuck wagon when everything was running low but quitting was not an option. Some folks would pack these leafy bundles in wax cloth for the day's ride, letting the salt and cabbage juices mingle into a strange, sour bite by noon. It was portable, filling, and far better than gnawing plain jerky for the fourth day straight. Eating like this reminded you, food was never just about flavor. It was about survival, pride, and learning to wrap your hunger in whatever nature handed you. If any of these gut-sticking sandwiches sparked a memory, tap that like button, hitch a ride in the comments with your own tales, and subscribe.